Richmond, Virginia. 1859. The auction house on Wall Street was packed with wealthy men, their eyes fixed on the platform where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the stench of fear. But this was no ordinary auction day. Word had spread through the city's elite circles about a particular item coming to the block, a young woman whose price would shatter every record in Virginia's brutal slave trade history. The girls were kept in special quarters, fed better than other enslaved people, dressed in fashionable clothing, and trained to perform for potential buyers. The business model was brutally efficient. Traders advertised discreetly in newspapers using coded language. Phrases like, "of fine appearance," "suitable for indoor service," or "raised in the house," signaled to buyers exactly what was being offered. Some buyers purchased fancy girls as concubines, keeping them in separate houses near their plantations. Others bought them as gifts for adult sons or business associates. The women became status symbols, proof of wealth and power. The trade operated in a gray area of social acceptance. Everyone knew what was happening, yet polite Southern society maintained elaborate pretenses. Buyers would officially purchase the women as housekeepers or personal servants. Society columns might mention a wealthy bacheloress, attractive mulatto servant without explicitly stating the relationship everyone understood existed. Records showed that Richmond's fancy trade generated millions of dollars annually by the 1850s. It represented a separate economy within slavery, one built entirely on the systematic sexual exploitation of young women who had no power to refuse, no protection under law, and no hope of escape. This was the world into which our story as protagonists was sold, a nightmare marketplace where human beings became luxury items, where youth and beauty became curses rather than blessings, and where the very concept of consent was impossible. The morning of the auction, Richmond's most exclusive slave trading house, Dick Hill & Company, prepared for what would become their most profitable sale of 1,859. The venue was on the public auction block where field hands were sold. This was a private showroom, elegantly furnished with velvet curtains, polished wooden floors, and gaslights that created an almost theatrical atmosphere. Invitations had been sent weeks in advance to select clientele, wealthy planters from Louisiana, Charleston merchants, Virginia aristocrats, and even politicians. Traveling under assumed names, the auction house understood discretion was essential for their most profitable transactions. Only men with verified wealth and social standing were permitted entry. The young woman at the center of this spectacle had been prepared for weeks. Traders had dressed her in an expensive silk gown, styled her hair in the latest fashion, and trained her to stand with perfect posture and maintain a demure expression regardless of how the men stared at her. She stood on a raised platform, illuminated by carefully positioned lamps that highlighted her light complexion and delicate features. The auctioneer, a man named Samuel Davis who specialized in fancy trade sales, began his presentation with practiced showmanship. The bidding opened at $1,000, already an astronomical sum that exceeded what most enslaved people would ever fetch. A Charleston merchant raised his paddle. Then a Louisiana sugar planter, Contar, with 1,200, a Virginia tobacco baron, sitting in the back row, signaled 1,500 without hesitation. The room buzzed with competitive tension. These weren't just business transactions. They were displays of masculine wealth and power. Each bid announced to the room, "I can afford what you cannot." The young woman stood motionless throughout, her face a practiced mask hiding whatever terror or resignation churned beneath. At $2,000, several bidders dropped out. At $2,500, only 3 remained. The auctioneer sensed the climax approaching and slowed his cadence, building dramatic tension. "Gentlemen, such quality is rarely offered, an investment that will appreciate for years to come." Double quotes. The final bid came from a wealthy New Orleans businessman, whose name appears in auction records simply as J. Beaumont. $3,000. The room fell silent. The auctioneer called for competing bids, twice, 3 times. None came. The gavel fell. The transaction took less than 15 minutes. A human life sold for the price of a small plantation. Beaumont signed the bill of sale with a flourish, paid in cash from a leather satchel, and arranged for discreet transportation of his new property to Louisiana. The young woman was led off the platform, no longer a person but a receipt, a transaction recorded in a leather ledger between sales of furniture and livestock. Her hands were shaking, but her face remained carefully neutral. She had just become the most expensive piece of human property in Virginia's history, and her nightmare was only beginning. The $3,000 price tag wasn't about labor. It wasn't about cooking skills, housekeeping abilities, or agricultural knowledge. The astronomical sum reflected something the antebellum South acknowledged in whispers, but never in polite conversation: the systematic sexual exploitation that fancy girls were purchased to endure. Wealthy white men bought these young women specifically as concubines. In a society where white women were placed on pedestals of purity and virtue, where sexuality was heavily repressed within marriages, enslaved light-skinned women became outlets for desires that couldn't be expressed elsewhere. The arrangement was built into the very foundation of Southern society. The legal framework made this exploitation not just possible, but consequence-free. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse their owners. Rape wasn't recognized as a crime when the victim was property. If a fancy girl became pregnant, the child would be born enslaved, adding to the owner's wealth. The system created a self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation and profit. For men like Jay Beaumont, purchasing a fancy girl served multiple purposes. It was a status symbol, proof of extraordinary wealth that other men would envy. It provided sexual access without the social complications of visiting brothels or risking scandal with white women, and it offered complete control over another human being, satisfying both physical desires and psychological needs for dominance. Many wealthy men kept fancy girls in separate houses near their plantations, visiting them regularly while maintaining respectable marriages with white wives. These arrangements were called shadow families, and they were common enough that neighborhoods in cities like New Orleans and Charleston had districts where such relationships were concentrated. Everyone could know, yet no one spoke openly about it. The psychological torture these women endured was incomprehensible. They had no choice in the matter, no ability to consent, and no escape. Many fancy girls were teenagers, some as young as 14, purchased before they fully understood what awaited them. Some fancy girls bore children who looked nearly white, children who would grow up enslaved despite their obvious paternity. These mixed-race children created painful complications, white half-siblings who would never acknowledge them, fathers who owned them as property. The psychological damage extended across generations. The economic incentive for traders was enormous. By grooming and selling fancy girls, they could make 10 times the profit of regular slave trading. This encouraged the deliberate targeting of light-skinned children, sometimes purchasing them specifically because a trader anticipated they would develop well for the fancy market. Young girls lived in terror of reaching puberty, knowing it might mean being sold into sexual slavery. Southern society maintained elaborate fictions around these relationships. Men would introduce their fancy girls as housekeepers or claim the children as servants born on their property. Ministers looked the other way. Legal documents used euphemistic language. The entire system operated on collective denial, everyone participating in the lie that allowed exploitation to continue without social consequences. For the young woman sold for $3,000, this was her reality. She wasn't purchased to keep house or tend gardens. She was purchased to be available whenever Jay Beaumont desired to submit to whatever he demanded to bear his children who would be born enslaved, and to live every day knowing she was property whose only value was her body. This was the impossible secret behind her extraordinary price, a secret everyone knew but no one would acknowledge. The journey from Richmond to New Orleans took 2 weeks. Jay Beaumont transported his new purchase by steamboat down the Mississippi River, keeping her confined to a small cabin below deck. She traveled in silence, knowing that speaking without permission could result in punishment, knowing that her life as she understood it had ended the moment that ox and gavel fell. Upon arrival in New Orleans, Beaumont didn't take her to his main plantation house, where his white wife and legitimate children lived. Instead, she was brought to a small cottage on the property's edge, a place hidden from the main road by oak trees and Spanish moss. This would be her prison, dressed up to look like a home. The cottage was surprisingly well furnished. Fine furniture, imported fabrics, a proper bed with clean linens. But these comforts weren't gifts, they were investments. Beaumont wanted his expensive property maintained in good condition, just as he would maintain a valuable racehorse or a prize-winning hunting dog. The illusion of comfort made the reality even more psychologically torturous. Her daily existence followed a carefully controlled pattern. An older enslaved woman named Ruth was assigned to bring meals and clean the cottage, but also to watch her, to report any signs of rebellion or escape attempts. Ruth had been in similar circumstances decades earlier, and her eyes carried the weight of shared trauma. She rarely spoke, but sometimes her hand would linger a moment longer when passing food, a small gesture of solidarity between prisoners. Beaumont visited the cottage 3 to 4 times weekly, usually in the evening after his family had retired. These visits lasted anywhere from an hour to the entire night. What happened during those visits is too brutal to describe in detail, but historical accounts from women who survived similar circumstances speak of dissociation, of training themselves to mentally leave their bodies while remaining physically present, of silent prayers that the ordeal would end quickly. Pregnancy was inevitable. Within 6 months, she was carrying Beaumont's child. The pregnancy brought mixed emotions, horror at bearing the child of her rapist, but also a desperate hope that motherhood might provide some purpose, some reason to continue surviving. Beaumont was pleased. The child would be his property, adding to his wealth. Some fancy girls attempted resistance in small ways. They would accidentally break expensive items, prepare meals poorly, or feign illness. But the consequences for overt rebellion were severe. Women who fought back were sold to brutal plantation overseers or sent to the Deep South, where conditions were even worse. The threat of being sold away from any children they bore kept most compliant through sheer terror. A few documented cases show fancy girls attempting escape. Some succeeded in reaching northern states or Canada through underground railroad networks, but most were caught, and the punishments were designed to serve as warnings to others: public whippings, branding, or being sold to slave traders who specialized in difficult slaves, heading to the most brutal labor camps. The psychological trauma was profound and permanent. Many fancy girls developed what we would now recognize as severe depression and PTSD. Some took their own lives, choosing death over continued existence in such circumstances. Others survived by creating elaborate mental compartmentalization, splitting themselves into the person they once were and the person they were forced to become. Historical records suggest our story's protagonist lived in that cottage for nearly 4 years. She bore 2 children, both light-skinned, both enslaved from birth. Beaumont never acknowledged them as his offspring in any legal sense, though their paternity was obvious to anyone who saw them. Her life became an existence measured in small survivals, making it through another day, another night, another visit from her owner. The woman who once stood on that auction platform slowly disappeared, replaced by someone who learned to feel nothing, to expect nothing, to hope for nothing. This was life after the sale. This was what $3,000 purchased. The story doesn't end with one woman's suffering. It echoes across generations, creating ripples that touched thousands of lives and shaped American history in ways we're still uncovering today. The young woman est 2 children, a daughter born in 1860 and a son in 1862, inherited their mother's enslaved status, despite their father's wealth and white appearance. Under the legal principle of partus sequitur ventrum, children inherited their mother's condition. They were born property, owned by the man who had fathered them. Growing up knowing their white half-siblings lived in the mansion while they remained in the cottage. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, everything changed, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. Beaumont joined the Confederate Army, leaving his plantation under an overseer's management. His visits to the cottage became less frequent. For the first time in years, the young woman experienced something resembling peace, even as the nation tore itself apart. In 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared enslaved people in Confederate states legally free, though enforcement remained impossible until Union forces arrived. New Orleans fell to Union troops in 1862, but rural Louisiana plantations remained under Confederate control for years. The woman heard whispers of freedom but could unrisk believing them. Hope had proven too dangerous in the past. Liberation finally came in 1865 when Union soldiers arrived at Beaumont's plantation. They found the woman, now 24 years old, living in the cottage with her 2 young children. She was free. After 6 years of captivity and exploitation, she was finally free. But freedom brought new terrors. She had no money, no education legally recognized by white society, and 2 small children depending on her. Beaumont, ruined financially by the war, offered nothing. He simply left Louisiana, abandoning the plantation and everyone on it. The woman never saw him again. Historical records become fragmentary here, but census documents and Freedmen's Bureau records suggest she took the surname Freeman, a common choice among newly emancipated people. She found work as a seamstress in New Orleans, using skills learned during her grooming for the fancy trade to earn barely enough for survival. Her children grew up in poverty, but they grew up free. The broader legacy of the fancy trade is staggering. Historians estimate tens of thousands of women were sold through this specialized market between 1820 and 1865. Most of their stories were never recorded. Auction houses destroyed records after the Civil War to protect the reputations of prominent buyers. Families never acknowledged the relationships or the mixed-race children produced. But genetics tells a story. Documentation tried to erase. DNA testing has revealed that approximately 30% of African Americans have European ancestry, much of it originating from precisely these kinds of exploitative relationships during slavery. Every fancy girl sold represents a line of descendants who carry this hidden history in their very DNA. The psychological trauma passed through generations as well. Children raised by mothers who had survived such exploitation inherited unspoken pain. The fancy trade created patterns of sexual violence and family disruption that affected communities for decades after emancipation. Scholars studying intergenerational trauma have identified lasting effects in African American families that trace directly back to slavery era. Sexual exploitation. Our story's protagonist lived until 1903, dying at age 62 in New Orleans. Her obituary was 3 lines in a colored newspaper, mentioning her work as a seamstress and her 2 surviving children. It made no mention of how she became enslaved, how much she was sold for, or what she endured. But her story, and the stories of thousands like her, represents one of American history. As darkest chapters, the fancy trade wasn't an aberration of slavery. It was slavery's logical conclusion. The ultimate expression of treating human beings as property to be used in any way owners desired. The record-breaking price paid for her wasn't a historical curiosity. It was a measure of society's moral collapse, a price tag placed on systematic rape, a transaction that revealed the depths of cruelty humans could inflict when law and custom provided no consequences. Her legacy is in the descendants who survived, in the historical record that cannot be completely erased. But it was spent on a single 18-year-old woman whose only crime was being born with light skin in a society that saw her as an object, not a person. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about American slavery. It was unjust about labor and economics. It was about power, control, and the systematic dehumanization of human beings to satisfy the darkest impulses of those who held that power. The fancy trade represents something historians struggled for decades to discuss openly. It reveals that slavery was not merely an economic system or a political issue. It was a framework that allowed wealthy men to purchase human beings, specifically for sexual exploitation, with complete legal protection and social acceptance. This young woman's impossible secret wasn't really a secret at all. Everyone knew